I've always hated working late. The office building where I worked had this hollow, eerie vibe after hours. You know, the kind where the fluorescent lights hum too loudly and your footsteps sound like someone else's. But the company I worked for, they didn't care about vibes. All they cared about were deadlines. I'd been stuck in the office for hours, finishing up a project we'd promised to a client by morning. My coworkers had all trickled out by 8 or 9 p.m., wishing me luck before leaving me to suffer alone. By the time I emailed the final report, it was 11:47 p.m. The office was deathly silent, except for the occasional groan of the air vents. I leaned back in my chair, stretched, and stared at the empty rows of desks. Normally, the hustle and chatter of the day filled the space, but now it felt like a tomb. I packed up quickly, eager to leave. My apartment wasn't far, just a short train ride away, but all I wanted in that moment was to get out of the building. I headed to the elevator bank. The polished floors reflected the dim overhead lights, and the air felt heavier than usual. I brushed it off as exhaustion. I hadn't eaten since lunch, and my brain was fried. When I hit the button for the elevator, the ding echoed unnaturally loud. The doors slid open, and I stepped inside. The car was spotless, with mirrored walls that gave me the unsettling feeling of being watched. I pressed the button for the lobby and leaned against the back wall, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The doors closed with their usual metallic hiss, and the elevator started its descent. That's when things got weird. The display above the doors showed the numbers ticking down. 8, 7, 6. But instead of stopping at the lobby, the numbers kept dropping. 5, 4, 3. I frowned and pressed the lobby button again. Nothing. The button didn't light up. None of them did. 2, 1. The elevator didn't slow down. It didn't even hesitate. B1, B2, B3. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I'd been in this building for 2 years and had never heard of a basement level, let alone 3. The air grew colder as the elevator plunged deeper. The hum of the motor sounded strained, like it was groaning under the weight of something heavy. I pressed the emergency stop button, but it didn't respond. B5, B6. By now, the walls of the elevator seemed darker, the mirrored reflections distorted. My reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong with its eyes. They were too wide, too sharp, like it was more aware than I was. The elevator jolted violently, knocking me off balance. When I scrambled to my feet, the display read B10. The car shuddered to a stop, and the doors slid open. What I saw wasn't a parking garage or even a mechanical room. It was a hallway, long, narrow, and dimly lit by a faint red glow that seemed to seep from the walls. The floor was cracked concrete, slick with some kind of dark, oily liquid. The air reeked of metal and rot, like blood left to bake in the sun. Every part of me screamed to stay inside the elevator, but something, curiosity, fear, or maybe something else, pulled me forward. I stepped into the hallway. The moment my foot hit the ground, the elevator doors slammed shut behind me, cutting off the only source of light. I whipped around and banged on the metal doors, yelling for help, but my voice just echoed down the corridor. I turned back to face the hallway, and that's when I noticed something. The walls weren't just cracked. They were moving, shifting subtly, like something beneath the surface was breathing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The only response was a faint, dripping sound, rhythmic and slow, like water hitting stone. I walked cautiously, my shoes squelching on the wet floor. The further I went, the darker it got. The red glow seemed to pulse, illuminating shapes in the distance, shapes that looked like doors. I approached the first one. It was made of rusted metal with a small grated window at eye level. When I peeked through, I almost screamed. Inside was a figure, human-shaped but distorted. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It stood perfectly still, but its eyes moved, locking onto mine through the grate. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The next door was worse. This one didn't have a window, but when I got close, I heard a sound, scratching, like nails dragging across metal. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear better, when it suddenly rattled violently. Something on the other side was slamming against it, trying to break through. I bolted. The hallway twisted and turned, its angles sharper than they should have been. It felt like I was running in circles, but every time I stopped, the air behind me felt wrong, like something was there, just out of sight. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't mine. I turned a corner and saw a figure at the end of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly tall, with arms that dragged along the floor. Its face was featureless, just smooth, pale skin stretched too tight over its skull. It didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me without eyes. Then it started gliding toward me, its limbs twitching unnaturally. I ran, no matter how fast I went. It seemed to gain on me. The hallway grew darker, the air heavier. My legs burned, and my chest heaved, but I didn't dare stop. Just when I thought it would catch me, I tripped and fell hard onto the concrete. When I looked up, I was back in the elevator. The doors slid open to the lobby, and the familiar hum of the building's AC filled my ears. I stumbled out, gasping for breath, and collapsed onto the cold marble floor. The security guard ran over, asking if I was okay. I couldn't even answer him. I quit my job the next day, but now every time I step into an elevator, I feel a twinge of dread. Sometimes, when I'm alone, the display flickers just for a moment, and I hear faint footsteps echoing somewhere below. I had always been told not to go into the basement, but like any curious child, I had to see what was down there. The house my family had moved into wasn't new. It had been abandoned for years, and the landlord had given us a great deal. Too great a deal, now that I think about it. The basement was locked, always. Every time I'd ask my mom about it, she'd give me some excuse like, the floor is unstable, or there's mold down there. But as I grew older, I started to realize something. The house wasn't just old, it was wrong. It felt like something was watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was coming from the basement. One day, when I was 14, I decided I'd had enough. My parents were out of town, and it was the perfect opportunity to find out what was really down there. I grabbed the old rusted key I'd found hidden in the attic and unlocked the basement door. The creak of the hinges echoed throughout the empty house. The basement wasn't like other basements. It wasn't just dark and cold. It felt alive, almost like it was breathing. There was a faint smell of decay, but the strangest part was the air. It was thick, almost suffocating. But what really sent a chill down my spine was the sound. There was a low, constant whispering coming from the dark corners. I turned on the light, and the first thing I saw was a child's drawing pinned to the wall. It was crude, drawn with what seemed to be charcoal or crayon, but it was terrifying. The drawing depicted a figure, a man with no face, and beneath it were 3 words. "He is waiting." I didn't understand what it meant, but I could feel it, the pressure, like something was watching me from the corners of the room. I backed away from the drawing, but that's when I heard it. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a low growl. I turned toward the back of the basement, where an old wooden door stood slightly ajar. I don't know why, but I had to open it. The moment I stepped through, the air changed. It felt heavy, like a storm was brewing. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw something, a pair of eyes, but no one was there. I turned back to the door, but it was gone. That's when I realized something terrible. I was no longer in the basement. I was in another place. The walls were covered in symbols, runes carved into the stone, and the floor was littered with old bones. The air was thick, like the weight of 100 years of darkness had settled in this room. But in the center, sitting cross-legged, was a figure, a man with no face, just like the drawing. His body was covered in scars, and his hands were like claws, long and sharp, twitching as though they could move at any moment. His head tilted toward me, and in that moment, I knew it wasn't just a man. The ground beneath me began to shake. The whispering started again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the very stones beneath my feet. I tried to run, but the room twisted. It stretched, became longer, darker. I could hear his footsteps, though I never saw him move. The floor was slick with something, and when I looked down, it was blood. Finally, I ran out of the room and found myself back in the basement. The door had disappeared, and I was alone. I could still feel him watching me. I never went back down there again, and now, whenever I close my eyes, I see those empty eyes watching me, waiting. I've never been a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts, curses, or the paranormal. At least, I didn't. That was before I moved into the house on Ridgeway Lane. It wasn't anything special, just a modest 2-story house with peeling paint and a small yard. It had been on the market for months, and the price was too good to pass up. I figured it needed some work, but I was handy enough to take care of it. The real estate agent was eager to make the sale. Too eager. She didn't even flinch when I asked why the house was so cheap. Just some lingering stigma, she said, waving her hand dismissively. I should have known then that something was off. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, fixing leaky faucets, and painting over the hideous mustard yellow walls in the kitchen. It wasn't until I started cleaning out the basement that things got strange. The basement was unfinished, with exposed beams and a cracked concrete floor. The previous owners had left a bunch of junk behind: rusty tools, broken furniture, and a stack of old VHS tapes in a cardboard box. I almost tossed the tapes without a second thought. I mean, who even owns a VCR anymore? But something about them caught my attention. The labels were handwritten, each one marked with a date: August 12th, 1997, September 3rd, 1998, October 14th, 2000. There were at least a dozen tapes, all neatly labeled in the same careful handwriting. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to keep them, It took me a week to track down a working VCR at a thrift store. By then, I'd almost forgotten about the tapes. But one rainy Saturday night, I decided to pop one in and see what was on it. The first tape was grainy, the kind of static-filled footage you'd expect from an old home movie. It showed a family sitting in a living room, smiling awkwardly at the camera. There was a man, a woman, and a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. They were just sitting there, not moving or speaking, as if they didn't know the camera was rolling. After a minute, the screen went black. I waited, thinking maybe the tape had ended, but then the picture flickered back on. This time, the camera was in a different room, what looked like a basement. The same man, woman, and child were there, but something was wrong. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and unfocused. They were standing in a line, perfectly still, as if they were waiting for something. Then the camera shifted, panning slowly to the left. I felt my stomach drop. There was someone else in the room. At first, I couldn't make out much, just a dark figure standing in the corner. But as the camera zoomed in, I saw it more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs and a face that seemed to shift and blur, like static on a TV screen. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at the family. The tape ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the static-filled screen. I told myself it was just some weird art project or a prank. Maybe the previous owners were into horror movies and made the tapes as a joke. But when I watched the second tape, I realized it wasn't a joke. The same family appeared, but this time they looked worse. Their skin was gray, their eyes sunken, and their movements were jerky, like marionettes on invisible strings. They were in the basement again, standing in that same line, and the figure was there, too. It was closer this time, towering over them, its head tilted to one side, as if it were studying them or me. I turned off the VCR and sat there in silence, my heart racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the corner, its distorted face leering at me. I decided to get rid of the tapes. The next morning, I packed them back into the box and drove to the dump. I tossed them into the landfill and didn't look back, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every night I dreamed of the basement, the family, the figure, and the sound. A low humming noise like 1,000 voices whispering in unison. A week later, I heard it in real life. It was around 2 a.m. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the hum. At first I thought it was just the wind or the old pipes in the house. But then it grew louder, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my chest. I got up, grabbing a flashlight, and followed the sound. It was coming from the basement. Every instinct I had told me not to go down there. But I couldn't stop myself. It was like something was pulling me, guiding my steps. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. The box of tapes was sitting in the middle of the floor. I know what you're thinking. Maybe I grabbed the wrong box, or maybe someone found the tapes and brought them back. But I swear, I threw them out. I saw them disappear into the landfill with my own eyes. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Then the humming stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me like a weight. And then, slowly, the lights began to flicker. In the brief flashes of light, I saw them. The man, the woman, the little girl. They were standing in the corner, their lifeless eyes fixed on me. And behind them, the figure. It was so close I could see its face, or what was left of it. Its skin was stretched tight over its skull, its mouth a jagged slash that twisted into something resembling a smile. I don't remember running up the stairs, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air. I moved out the next day. I didn't tell anyone why. I didn't try to sell the house. I just left. But sometimes late at night, I hear the hum, and I know the tapes are still out there, waiting for someone else to find them.